WULAAKWUNUWII. Good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to NEEKAAWA, KIHTAACHIIMUWAK, WULAAKWUNUWII. This evening, they tell stories. There's going to be three stories that are going to be shared this evening that originate from Munsee Delaware Nation. And these stories came from the community. And for those that aren't familiar with Munsee Delaware, it's a small reserve that's located on the Thames River, just about 35 minutes southwest of London, Ontario. So this is, I guess, when you put it out to the universe, good things happen. And I think this is a direct example of this. So last year when we held this story evening, a fellow by the name of John Nicholas joined the group. And he had sort of taken part in a couple of introductory Munsee language classes. And his family are from Munsee. So they still have land there. His brother, Daniel, who just recently passed, and he, I believe, lived in Ohio most of their lives. So this fellow reached out from Portland, Oregon, and he said, "Hey, you know what? My family has a story." I said, "Oh, that's wonderful. Would you be willing to share it?" And he says, "Yeah, I'd be really, I'd love to get your opinion on whether it's something that should be translated," because he was fairly intrigued by the fact of Jacob's story last year, John Moses' relative's poem. He was very interested in seeing if this story could be translated from English to Munsee. So the challenge with this story, not so much a challenge. Oh, and by the way, he gave permission for me to share pieces of it tonight because it's not quite finished, but he's been kept in the loop since its inception. So when I do translations, I pass them on to him for his review. The challenge with the story is it's written in English, much as the poem "The Missing Airman" was, and it's written in English by an English speaker, a first speaking language speaker. So it's written in wonderful prose in English. However, it's not very helpful when you translate it into Munsee, which means that along the way you're going to have to come up with different ways of saying things to get the whole idea across that's in English. So you'll also notice on the few slides coming up that you'll see highlighter. And Melissa, bless her heart, said, "Do you want me to keep the highlighting in?" And I said, "Yeah, absolutely," because those are parts of where I need to go back to the family, or I have gone back to the family to suggest this as a possible translation where I'm having trouble taking the English and making it into something that would work in the Munsee language. So those are things that I have to go back to John and family and discuss with them if that's okay. I don't have a lot of background to the story. John didn't share, when it happened, where it happened, whether it's a complete fiction or whether it's actually part of family lore. And I think that's part of the best part of storytelling, where you've got a little bit of mystery, and John was able to share what he wanted to share, and he trusted me as someone who could translate the story to the best of his abilities. And another thing I'll point out is that the last story, Shihsuwanakuw, and this one, The Kiss of the First Snow, there's a better approach in terms of my own translation abilities, and I think that just comes with time and working with the language an awful lot. I would not say that in any way that this is a perfect translation, and like I mentioned, it's a living document, but there is a much improved process that I have when working with the language, and I think that just simply comes with time, but also some dedication. So I don't let the language go very long, especially working in an English world as I do. It's important that I try and find some balance. So whether that's a piece a night, a little 30 minutes here, an hour there, it's like working out, right? Or riding a bike, right? Getting some exercise. It's an exercise for your linguistic side of your brain. This story is a real endurance for someone who's a second language speaker, because it's 7 pages long, 7 pages single spaced. So John failed to mention that when he he said, yeah, I got a story for you. And I'm like, okay, I'm good for a page, right? That's kind of the stuff that that I send to Catherine or that I've had to translate with Karen. But 7 pages is a marathon of language translation work. So I am not going to read 7 pages tonight. What I can share with you though is I'm at page 5.5 of translation before I have to go back and make my corrections and have somebody's eyes, a second set of eyes, look at the text. But it is a 7 page story. Um, well, so I present to you the kiss of the first snow. There's the beautiful Thames River with the first kiss of snow. I think this is back a couple years ago from the Oneida Bridge. It might even be from Oneida. I don't know. Let's see. Sorry for the delay. I just got to remove. Yeah, there you go. Okay. The Kiss of the First Snow. I've not translated the title yet because that needs to be discussed with the family. Wimbat kalak pasiu, piska, iaskwa, kalishmish, tengi kanash, waak mata kawiw. Neka kunawalendam, mamalawa takasito, Shokalish, Shokalaponcho, Walk, Shokalaponcho, Shokalaponisho, Walk, Shokalaponcho. Naka Matatin Tami, Ali Yonk, Shaya Kalishmish, Najan Matawichika, Naka Equausit, Apwid Nukaton, Naka Saquinaco, Naka Wawiton, Na Tatamun Kawi. Walk Naka Mata Maya Walindum Lishmasa Takik John Fachimat Walk Tataman Wichamawat Kawiw. John Salamwit Hapash laachumohkawaat. John Apichnang Awan Uspakuso Sakihiken Wakwung naxpii Wulaaakahunat Koch KIHTAACHIIMUWAK. Willa Tilla Sakwalamat Ni Mata Kawit Endani Ki Katatang aanihkwaachiimuw. John. Naka Lundum Nakash Lapi Notona Ashta Naxpii Quishquintonet Naka O Quini Nalita Nimata Chilato Kanjin Nakwaf Yaskwa Kwaikishkwi. Huel Litiheawak Na Kalishmas Wamak Shuk Wuli Lawanin Shuk Kalish Machine Ilaskwa Munsee Wak Wawitowak Yonkwai Kanjin Nakwak. Wiskinchqual Amangalak Kingwechin Naka Chengishisho Endanaka Laachumohkawaat Ditjan Chitamus KIHTAACHIIMUWAK waak listawak. So part of what I talk about in terms of a language class when I'm back home 2 weeks ago, sorry, last week I was back for sort of a 2-day session, was that it's important to speak the language, to speak it out loud, to hear yourself speak it without worrying whether everything's going to be perfect. I don't, the time to be perfect will happen in life. But when you're learning the language, really trying to express yourself as best you can, without that fear of judgment is so important. And, when we gathered together back home on the community, we were, we were playing charades, and, people were having to talk about Valentine's words and building snow craters, and they had to use the language vocally. And that is, I think, so important. As Munsee people, we have to take back our language. We have to speak it. And I think, like I said before, I think Karen's with me in presence, and she's smiling because I'm using language. But I also believe that, a lot of my family who did speak the language are, spiritually appreciative, right? Because you're choosing to not use English and not use French all the time, but you're also using the language of the people in any way you can. And I think that's so important for beginners and for people who are, just want to start using the language. And for those that, who have the language, it's so important to use it if you can, if you're in your position to do so. You did notice that there's that highlighting piece. So I did struggle with, I think, one that just had sort of an English sort of euphemism, like finally, after debating with himself. It's awfully hard to find like the word debating in the Munsee dictionary, or, I'm having a conversation with myself, and maybe that's a way that I could approach this piece. But after debating with himself about the wisdom of it all is a very, very an English way of writing, right? Which doesn't necessarily just translate straight up right over to Munsee. So that's something that I need to go back to the Nicholas family with and say, okay, is there another way that I could say this that would be okay and not, sorry, and get the story across. So like I said, it's 7 pages. I don't even think I'm going to read 7 pages for the next reading, because that's quite a lot. So, but there's another one. So John's father, I'm having trouble with possessives. So I know there's people out there that can help me with those. So I tried to get around it by saying he thought for a while instead of John's father. So that's a piece that I highlighted for myself, that I have to go and ask people about possessives, and if there's a better way of saying it instead of neeka, which is, again, it's just the pronoun he as opposed to John's father. So, but if neeka works, then that could be something that I go back to the family with. I don't know if there's anything else I can talk about. This is, again, this is, I think, the first 2 paragraphs of the first page. So it goes into a really wonderful story, which I'm not going to ruin. But it's a very wonderful story about how, it explains things, which is like quite cool. Maybe do you want to open it up for questions, Suzanne, about that one? I'm going to grab some water.
Yeah, absolutely. And do get some water. It's a lot of reading. There are a couple different questions, and I think it might be good to start with a question from Lily Kim, which is about the language. She says, Anishik, Ian, your enunciation is wonderful and Catherine's renderings are perfect. I noticed the English use of gender pronouns and feelings like excitement. Are there other words that do not translate straight up to Munsee? And here, I guess, is an example. And maybe, I don't know if, Ian, you might like to sort of explain literally to people who are less familiar with the language, word for word, what some of the words you've chosen are, as opposed to the very somewhat different way that it's in the English.
Sure. So if we go back a page, Let's see. Yeah. Nope. Go back another maybe. Trying to think of a good one. So we'll stay here for a second because if you look at the bottom, it says and John oh. So that's a fairly straight up translation. I enjoyed this page the most because A, it's fairly short, and B, there's not too many complicated words. So means yes in the language, or it's an acknowledgement. It might not necessarily just mean yes, but yeah, okay. And John means John in the language, so that is a Munsee version of a name. And then O means said. So it's a fairly close rendering of what was asked. If we go back, I'm just trying to think here.
I
So
think there's another page with the highlighting. I don't know if Melissa
sure.
wants to share that one that you could
Mhm.
Pachimat, for example. Just thinking
So
about
this, yeah, this one, I'd have to go back into my notes. So Pakik means finally, John. So what I said was John
called over, I think, right?
yeah, called out and wanted so I don't know if it's wanted help falling asleep. I think that's how I used it because the word plead doesn't appear in the dictionary. Debating with himself about the wisdom of it doesn't appear, or you got to come up with a way around it. So it says here, finally John called out to his called out and asked for help to go to sleep.
Awesome. Are there other things you wanted to share about the language here, Ian, or should I bring another question? There's one that might be one that Katherine might want to comment on. People were expressing appreciation for the story, and Joseph Fonseca said, "Thank you, very interesting story." And he says, I'm sure it will also be beautifully illustrated in time. And I don't know if Katherine will be doing illustrations for this one or another artist, but I wonder, thinking about the artist process, if there's ideas that already come into your mind about how to make visible the kinds of things we hear in story.
I think that's a very interesting question. I'm not sure quite how to answer it because I think it's very difficult for me to like verbalize my creative process. But I feel like, I don't know, blues are coming to my mind, like gray blues. I did a lot of I was very fond of the illustrations of the room that I did in the last story that at the last story evening. I'm sorry, I'm completely blanking. But I'm very fond of like the child's room. I feel like it's a fun thing to illustrate. And I think that there are a lot of like very clear visuals. Like his mind is filled with joyous thoughts. He calls out to his father. I think that a lot of it can be very exaggerated and very, very meaningfully illustrated.
Thanks, Katherine. There's a couple other questions. One is somebody commenting again about language that it's Jill Ratner says, I got behind schedule, so I was making dinner during the first 30 or 40 minutes. Therefore, I couldn't get to read the English, although I was able to glance at the pictures as Ian was speaking. And yet somehow I knew exactly what was happening, even though I don't know the language at all, which is a wonderful tribute to the artistry and the language. There's one other question that I don't know if Ian, you might want to talk about a little bit, that is actually pointing toward the history side of things. Responding to an earlier comment, this is Rick Kitchen writes, with regard to an earlier comment, you mentioned some folks that live in Munsee. Where is Munsee? I only came up with Munsee, New York in a search, one of many such places. And he says, I live about an hour south of the Stockbridge Munsee Community Band of Mohican Indians Reservation area in Northeast Wisconsin. And I'm not suggesting a whole story, but I wonder if you want to say a little bit about that.
Sure. So I guess first off, I should say that I call it Munsee because that's what people said. So I spent a lot of time living in a town called St. Thomas, Ontario, where my grandmother lived. And my grandmother would go out to what she called the farm. And the farm was on Munsee. So we're going out to the farm on Munsee. And what she meant was that we're going out to Munsee, Delaware. Now, we didn't really ever say Munsee, Delaware. We just said Munsee. So there's lots of names that that the community goes by and the language goes by, but I'm only using the one that I guess has kind of stuck with me since I was a small child. Our community was established sometime after, very shortly after 1780, when a group of Munsee people left Six Nations, which is near Brantford, Ontario, and they moved westward to settle on the Thames River. And prior to that, we had sort of waited at the Niagara River for the English to open up Upper Canada, which was then Quebec. And we decided not to wait for them and just go across the river ourselves and settle at a place called Dunnville. And prior to that, groups of us came from along the Susquehanna. Many people went to Ohio and then came across at the Detroit River end, or went further west to Kansas and to Oklahoma. So Munsee is also a term used for the language spoken. So the Munsee language is one of the three dialects of the Lenape language, and that's the one that's primarily spoken here in Ontario between the three communities. Question.
This is a question from Adam DePaul, who writes, people sometimes have a hard time understanding that our people are diverse in faith as any other, that Lenape people represent many faiths, Lenape, Christian, Buddhist, and so on. In this wonderful work, you relate a Lenape story that embraces Christian themes. Has this ever been something that you've been placed in the position to have to justify or defend? Has anyone ever ridiculously asked you of not being authentic to Lenape tradition? That's a big question, but I wonder if there's a little bit you'd like to respond to that.
No, well, specifically to the question, no. However, my skin color is oftentimes as seen as something that requires explanation. So more than my ability to speak a language, or more than my ability to have lived with a community for almost 51 years, it's more my skin color and my eye color that are things that always need explanation. Now, on the flip side, I also get I get into a lot of conversations that I probably wouldn't hear if people knew exactly my background. So oftentimes I do have to explain that, hey, my mom is from Munsee, Delaware. My dad is an immigrant who came here after World War II from England. So while I do have those blended roots, in my daytime job, but also in my in my schooling, there's always that need to, or that you have to not defend yourself, but you really do have to fully explain who you are, because people they don't quite understand, right? That you could, that you could have touched a language, or you could have learned stories, or lived on a reserve, so you're a 10, right? And they're going, but you don't fit the mold, right? So there's that explanation. From a religious standpoint, that's never been questioned, I guess. Sometimes communities can be divided. I'll put it that way, where there are people that believe in sort of what would be classified as the older ways. There's people that believe in Western religion or Eastern religion. That's never really been an issue. It's more what's visual as opposed to what's practiced, I guess. When I was a kid, if you spoke language, though, that was a red flag, right? Or if you talked about things from the old days, that was considered a bit of a red flag. So for my family, we lived what was close to the forest. There used to be an old road that used to go through to Middlemiss, Ontario. It didn't go through, but we lived right on the edge of a huge forest, right? And of course, that bred some suspicion, and that's all part of, you know, the Indian Act here in Canada, the residential schools, you know, the coming of religion, right, in terms of deciding what's right, what's wrong, and those were all sorts of things that I think historically, back in the 70s, that was things that would raise a red flag or an eyebrow. I don't know what they're doing or what they're speaking, but that's all part and parcel of, you know, the colonizer, I believe. That's a whole nother, that story night.
Mm. You want to take one more question because we could, and then maybe at 7 we'll start the third story. There's a question from Robin Chandler who says, my dad told me the story of Corn Woman when I was very small. His family said they were Munsee from the New Jersey area. Is there a Corn Woman story in the tradition of the Munsee from Canada?
I don't know. I think that's another good point about the stories that are here. These are, well, sorry, five of the stories are either one my creation, but the other 4 that you'll hear from or have heard, sorry, there's 3, are stories that are particular to my family, the Logan family. Those are stories that I overheard as a kid, or that have been passed on, or that have been reported in the press. I don't know the story of Cornman, so it could be, but I've never heard it. And that's part of, I think, the greater scope of this evening, plus, you know, mentioning it and passing on the community, is that we're looking for those stories. So when John shared the First Kiss of Winter, there's a family sharing a story. So we're hoping that, you know, more stories come to light, or that people would be willing to share them, right, in every which way. So that's the hope. So maybe one day we'll hear about the story of Cornwall.
We've shared that recordings of last year's Munsee Delaware Story Night from last February, which includes readings by 2 of our speakers last year. If you go to that page and scroll down a little bit to last February, you'll see recordings there. So we'll just say Laachumohkawaat to everyone, and see you at the next event. We'll have events coming up in the course of the year, and then next February will be, I hope, the 3rd annual story evening. Anishik, Ian, Anishik, Katherine.
Aanihkwaachiimuwak.
Pitchkanal.